Hello, my name is Brett Crocker. For my astronomy class, I will be talking a little bit today about the ninth planet in our solar system, Pluto. Well, that is what people originally thought anyway. Over the years, scientists all over the world who studied what was once considered to be a planet have actually removed that title from Pluto. In the years since, there has been quite a debate among astronomers as to whether Pluto is a planet or not. This has then led to more debates on the subjects of what exactly defines a planet, why should size have anything to do with being classified as a planet, and if Pluto and other potential objects have the right shape as well as a moon similar to that of the moons of normal planets, how can Pluto not be a planet? And so on. It is certainly safe to say that this is an important topic in our world today, and this debate is not one that will be put to rest anytime soon. So let's see if I can help shed light on some of the facts about Pluto and allow you, the viewer, to make up your own decision on whether you think Pluto is a planet or not. In more cases than not, the general go-to argument for people trying to prove Pluto is not a planet is its size, or lack thereof, rather. Compared to the other planets in our solar system, Pluto is considered to be tiny. Neil deGrasse Tyson is considered to be one of, if not the most essential figure in exposing Pluto and getting its title as a planet removed. We look at some of his most famous comparisons of Pluto to other objects in our solar system and our world and see why some would consider it not to be a planet based on size and size alone. There is no denying, no matter which side of the debate that you are on, Pluto is small. Its mass is 1/20th the size of our smallest planet, Mercury. And it doesn't stop there. Earth is the sixth biggest planet in our solar system. Earth's moon is larger than Pluto is. And I don't just mean it is larger by a little bit. No, it is roughly 5 times larger than Pluto is in terms of mass. This is an absurd statistic when you really think about how small that means Pluto really is compared to our planets. Another argument that deGrasse Tyson makes is if Neptune, our 4th largest planet, was the size of a Chevy Impala, what size would Pluto be in comparison? Most people would probably wager to guess that Pluto would be about the size of a car a little bit smaller than the Chevy Impala. Maybe like a Mini Cooper or a smart car, deGrasse Tyson says. But no, those guesses would be quite inaccurate. If Neptune were the size of a Chevy Impala, that would make Pluto about the size of a Matchbox car in comparison. Meaning Pluto is not even close in size. So how, if Pluto is barely even a speck when it's compared to our other massive planets, is Pluto allowed to even be in the conversation of being a planet? The general counter-argument to Pluto being too small is that size does not matter when it comes to characterizing what is and what isn't a planet. No scientists out there are denying the fact that if you were to base it solely on size, that Pluto should not be considered a planet. However, most would argue for Pluto being a planet would say that size is a non-factor compared to shape. And in terms of shape, Pluto fits the bill undeniably. Unlike a lot of asteroids, Pluto is shaped like a sphere, just as the other planets. Not like a potato shape, as any of asteroids tend to be. One of the biggest factors for a planet is having a gravitational pull that is strong enough to pull objects in from around it and form itself into a sphere-like shape. Every other planet in the solar system can do that with ease. But the matter that makes things complicated is that Pluto can too. So if Pluto is capable of doing what every other planet is capable of doing, why should Pluto not be considered a planet just because it is smaller than those other planets? Another thing that is often brought up when trying to make the argument for Pluto as a planet is the surface of Pluto. The surface of Pluto is textured and also has both bright and dark areas on the surface, thus making it similar to any other planet. With these facts in mind, it is sometimes difficult to say that Pluto is not a planet. One of the mega arguments against Pluto, however, is that its orbit is far different than that of the undeniable planets. This is primarily because the orbit of Pluto is tilted, unlike the other planets. Pluto's orbit is inclined at an angle of 17 degrees. Most planets orbit the Sun in a near circle. The Sun is in the center of that circle. So planets circle around the Sun perfectly in every orbit. But Pluto does not orbit in a circle. The orbit of Pluto is shaped like an oval, rather, and therefore the Sun is not in the center. This means that at some points in Pluto's orbit, it is actually closer to the Sun than at other points of its orbit. Because of this tilt, Pluto actually crosses over the orbit of other planets in the process of its own orbit, whereas all the other planets do not cross each other at all. They are all in complete sync. Why, if Pluto were the same as every other planet, would it have an orbit that is so different from every other one? It is tough to make a counterargument for the orbit of Pluto. Just like size, there is absolutely no denying that if you were to look at Pluto's orbit, and that alone, that Pluto would not be a planet. One thing about Pluto and its orbit that does make it relatively similar to the other planets is that Pluto does have its own moons that act in orbit with it. Pluto has 5 moons: Charon, Styx, Nix, Kerberos, and Hydra, of which Charon is the largest by far. Normally, this would act in favor of the argument for Pluto being considered a planet. However, in this case, it almost acts against Pluto. Because Charon is so large in relative size to Pluto, it is hard to consider Pluto a planet. With most planets' moons, they are tiny in comparison to the planet. Charon is over half the size of Pluto and nearly 1/8 of the mass of Pluto. It is so large that recently scientists have started considering the two a double dwarf planet because neither of them is big enough to be a real planet, but they are both too big to be considered anything else. There is no other planet in the solar system like that, making for a convincing argument as to why Pluto should not be considered a planet. The Kuiper Belt is a part of our solar system that is found beyond our planets. It is made up of small objects that were made when our solar system was formed. Like Pluto, a lot of the objects in the Kuiper Belt are formed primarily of ice. That is because they are found beyond our normal planets and aren't exposed to as much heat as those objects that are closer. Along with Pluto, the Kuiper Belt is also home to 2 more dwarf planets, Make and Haumea. Because a lot of those objects in the Kuiper Belt are made of ice, Pluto is considered to be more of a Kuiper Belt object than a planet. It is far more closely related to those objects in the Kuiper Belt than a planet. Not even to mention where it lies in our solar system compared to the other planets. Also, to bring up the size argument again, Pluto is not even the biggest object inside the Kuiper Belt. So then, That also leads to the argument as to whether those other objects in the Kuiper Belt should be considered planets as well, or whether them, along with Pluto, should be simply considered other things than planets. Because of this confusion, the debate has led to a debate as to what a planet really is. The debate over whether or not Pluto is a planet is filled with much controversy. Sides constantly come up with new arguments over why it should and shouldn't be considered a planet. What is lacked, however, in this debate was a clear definition as to what a planet really is. In 2006, the International Astronomical Union decided to come up with a clear-cut definition for what a planet really is. This was meant to put to bed the debate between planets and non-planets, or dwarf planets. Their definition states that in order to be considered a planet, an object had to be a celestial body which, 1, is in orbit around the Sun, check, 2, has sufficient mass to assume hydrostatic equilibrium, or a sphere shape, check. And finally, the third thing that was added is that it has cleared the neighborhood around its orbit. If an object does not do all of those things, it cannot be considered a planet, and it is simple as that. Any object that does the first two of the three qualifications is considered to be a dwarf planet. Now, this was a groundbreaking development in determining what is a planet. Now, because before 2006, planets had not needed to clear the objects in their neighborhood in order to be considered a planet. Even the original definition in 2006 was that it had to be round and orbit the Sun. However, that created way too many additional planets that had not even been in consideration before. The acceptance of this definition effectively ended the time for Pluto being recognized as a planet. Pluto is simply not big enough to be able to clear the neighborhood around it, thus ending its chances of staying listed as our 9th planet, unfortunately for those who supported its case. With that definition set as to what defines a planet, one would think that the argument would be over. Every object is either a planet or it isn't. However, things would not prove to be that simple. Like most everything in today's day and age, people just seem to want to argue. The debate on whether Pluto is a planet is certainly no exception. Astronomers and common people alike that are convinced that Pluto is a planet have since started saying that the definition of what a planet is wrong. They argue primarily that what is around a planet should not affect that object's status as a planet, meaning that because Pluto is not big enough to clear the neighborhood around it, should not mean anything at all. It should not even be considered when deciding whether something is a planet. It is far more important to consider the characteristics of the object itself, and when it comes to that, Pluto would pass the test of being a planet. It is quite round and big enough to be considered a planet. It orbits the Sun like all of the planets do. Its size may be a knock against it, but it is not enough to determine that Pluto is not a planet. Because Pluto is not considered a planet, it has to be listed as something. That is when it was established that Pluto would be considered a dwarf planet. As I mentioned before, dwarf planets are those objects that pass 2 out of the 3 qualifications for being a planet. They are big enough that they have a gravitational pull strong enough to bring in objects and crush them well enough to form them into a spherical shape, as well as the fact that they orbit the Sun around the Sun. The only thing they cannot do is clear the neighborhood around them. But this should not be considered because the size of a planet does not discredit it from being considered a planet. People that argue for Pluto being a planet say they are simply planets that haven't grown as much as other planets because there aren't as many objects around them to attract with gravity. This is potentially a valid argument, but for the time being, it is not a factor. Because according to the official definition agreed upon by the International Astronomical Union, is that it is necessary for a planet to have cleared the objects around it. One argument I found particularly interesting, however, was the argument made that a miniature dog is still a dog. A slightly silly concept that actually serves as a very valid point. Whether the dog is a St. Bernard or a Chihuahua, it is still considered to be a dog. The same argument can be made with any other animal. Whether it is a blue whale or an ant, they are both considered animals. So why would it be any different when it comes to planets? Size shouldn't determine whether something is a planet or not. Yes, there are planets much smaller than others, but they are not classified as something different. They should not be considered a dwarf planet. They should just be considered a smaller planet. So, as we see, there are countless different arguments for and against Pluto being named a planet or not. There is no denying that Pluto is far different than the other planets in our solar system. It is not as big, its orbit is different, and it has not cleared the neighborhood of all objects. Its surface is made mostly of ice. It would form a tail if it were closer to the sun, making it more like a comet, and it lies so far from the sun, all the way in the Kuiper Belt. However, there are many characteristics that make it just as much of a planet as other things. It does orbit the sun, it is a sphere shape, and it has its own moons, leading a seemingly never-ending debate as to what Pluto really is. One thing is for certain, both sides will never agree. Even with a clear-cut definition, we see the side in favor of Pluto being a planet arguing against the definition. I hope this presentation proved to be insightful and helpful in allowing you to make your own decision on whether Pluto is a planet or not. Thank you, and have a good day.